some oxygen back to the brain. Great to have you back. Could I ask, if you are back, if you don't mind popping up a thumbs up on Zoom, or switching on your video, if you'd like to show us a wave. I see a bunch of faces there. Gabriella, Christina. Hi, Christina. Good to see you. Haven't seen you in a while. Roxani, Jamie, all kinds of thumbs up. Wonderful. Lots of us back in the room, ready to go. And of course, feel free to keep your camera on if you're comfortable doing so. We'd love to see your smile throughout the program. So colleagues, it's exciting that we're now getting into the content part of the course. As we've said that, there are a number of people on the course with a lot of experience in Foresight. And so if you have something interesting to share, by all means, pop it in the chat or raise a hand. We can always take some input from you and make the course that much more exciting. I want to start with this notion of the foundations of Foresight, really laying a foundation around the definition and the benefits of Foresight. What Foresight is, or Foresight, not only Foresight as an academic field or a theoretical field, but Foresight as an applied field where we learn how to do Foresight, do projects based on Foresight, and make change in the world using Foresight. And so let's get into that foundation here. What I'm sharing with you on the screen, it looks like, let's have a look if, there we are, there's a picture. What I'm sharing with you on the screen here is a photo, or it's an image of a 1900, in the year 1900, Paris exhibition, where a bunch of artists were asked to think about the future, how they imagine the future to be in 100 years later, right? So what would that be? The year 2000, how would they imagine the future to be? And this particular image was of the future of education. Now, if you look at that image, what do you observe? If you want to write in the chat, what do you see in that image that you find interesting about how people in the 1900s, of course, they were Parisians, as opposed to people from Beijing or Sao Paulo, but at least people in the 1900s in Paris. How did they think about the future 100 years later? What stands out for you as interesting? Who would like to pop something in the chat of what you find surprising, maybe, in that image? I see Mona saying headphones, right? That's very interesting. We're all sitting here on Zoom with headphones, people really relying on technology. Absolutely. You've got the professor there crunching the books into a machine. Of course, there's a crankshaft, so it's a mechanical vision of education. Someone notices there, very interestingly, Ariana, no girls in the classroom. We tend to have that. There's been a debate once about, well, maybe there are a couple of them that could be female, we don't know, or could be girls, but certainly it looks like a male-dominant worldview of what education would look like. Gabriella saying consuming information, right? So education in that model, still very much a one-way street from the professor through the books into the machine to the student. Very little by way of bi-directional or group-based communication. Tina also saying very technocentric, but at the same time, very traditional. And so what's interesting about this image is the way in which, when we think about the future, we tend to get locked into a future that looks a lot like the past, right? The inability to reimagine the future. And so what we tend to do is we tend to take aspects of the present or aspects of the past, and we tend to project those into the future in a sort of an uncomfortable composite of what might emerge. Now, some of those visions of the future or images of the future, some of them might be correct. Certainly, technology is today part of education. In some parts of the world, gender imbalance is very much still part of education. It certainly is the case that professors at academic institutions often are male and tend to look a certain way and wear bow ties. But at the same time, education has also become fundamentally different with things like massive open online courses over the internet, with ubiquitous knowledge, artificial intelligence-based learning. I remember a couple of years ago, 3 years ago or so, my son coming to me and picking up my phone and pushing the button and saying, "Siri, show me the pipes inside my body." And I took the phone from him and I said, what on earth are you doing? And he said, well, he was 9 years old. He said, well, you told me there are pipes inside my body where the food goes. I want to learn what they are. And so here's a child of 7 using an AI to get information, to learn. And so the model of education 100 years later looks somewhat similar to this image of the future, but yet could look vastly different. And so when we are doing foresight, which is what we're going to learn about in this program, what we're trying to do is to break out of those rather linear or incremental visions of the future. It's quite interesting if you look at that quote by Thomas Watson at IBM, 1943, I think there's a world market for maybe 5 computers, right? So a very sort of narrow, limited perspective of what's possible on the basis of past assumptions. And so when we do foresight, what we're trying to do is to break out of those dominant assumptions about the future. I think it's Peter Senge who refers to those assumptions as mental models. What we're trying to do is we're trying to challenge our mental models, and of course, challenge the mental models of those around us. You'll see there H.M. Warner from Warner Brothers, 1927. Who the hell wants to hear actors talk? Going back to an era where television was mimes on screen. And today, of course, we've got podcasts, we've got Netflix. And so with foresight, we can open up that, what one might call the cone of possibilities or plausibilities of what the future might hold. And so that's really what we're trying to do. Now, if we look at foresight and we look for a more formal definition, we might go to someone like Marie Conway, who's a great futurist out of Australia, who says strategic foresight is an organized, systematic process to engage with uncertainty. I think Pete also mentioned that, uncertainty regarding the future. Now, what makes that different to a person just thumb sucking and coming up with an idea about what the future could be? Well, foresight is trying to be systematic about that and organized about that. And what we achieve when we are systematic is we essentially falsify some of the alternative imaginations that we might have about the future. And that, of course, means that we have a more robust perspective of what the future might be. The European Union there for the For-Learn project saying foresight is a systematic, participatory, future intelligence gathering, medium to long-term vision building aimed at enabling present-day decisions. What I love about that definition is it links the work of foresight, the systematic, participatory, future intelligence, it links it back to present-day decision-making for mobilizing joint action. So that's great because it sort of echoes what Pete was saying, that we don't see foresight as an intellectual endeavor. It's really about a activist endeavor. It's about a way of being in the world or acting in the world, but informed by what the future might hold. Now, what are some of the benefits of doing foresight? Some of these have come up already in the conversation, but we tend to think that there are really 3 of them. The one is around building vision or making strategic choices. And so in an organization, if you're looking at the future, let's say you're in an organization like a tech company building smartphones, is the future of telephony a smartphone? Or is the future of telephony, built-in microchips in the bone behind your ear that connects with the internet wirelessly? What are those strategic choices, investments, policies that you might need to make? And can you use foresight to expand your vision of what those choices might be? On the other hand, it's also very powerful in mitigating risks. We see now in the world of climate change, of course, what foresight can do in helping communities imagine a future where those risks have been materialized, and what we can do in the meantime to prevent those risks from occurring or to prepare ourselves in response to those risks. And then perhaps you could say in between the first and the second, between vision and risk, there's this piece around awareness and agility. Strategy, and we're not going to get off track into the field of strategy, but strategy to a large extent is about change and agility. It's about adaptive responses to new reality. And so foresight, what it does, if you use it correctly, is it enhances your capacity for agility and awareness. So those are some of the key benefits. Now, in the readings that we shared with you, We've listed the 4 of them on the right-hand side. Those who've had a chance to read them on House Space, of course, the first there is the book review, which Jennifer's book there on the future, a very short introduction, will give you a lovely little basic understanding of the field. And then on the right-hand side, the soft primer for Foresight. You could think about that as a reference material for the rest of the program. It's got some lovely definitions in it. It's got some comments about methodology in it. And it's really a starting point to get you out the blocks on what this thing called Foresight is. Now, when we do Foresight, as Pete mentioned, we're not just doing it for the purpose of gathering new intelligence or new information, but we are doing it to inform the decision makers, and through that process to drive participation and transformation. So I'm thinking of a colleague of mine who does Foresight in India, where she travels around the country, bringing communities together to have systematic conversations about the future of their village. And in the process, she's upending some of the old lock-in ways of thinking and doing that communities might have around water security and energy provision and the participation of girls, for instance, in the economy. And so Foresight is about shifting the minds of the decision makers in that way. Importantly, we do see Foresight as a personal journey of systemic transformation. In other words, Foresight is not something that we do in an ivory tower behind closed doors in order to publish. You might publish, but the purpose of how we do Foresight is not to publish irrelevant journal articles somewhere in an obscure academic ivory tower. Rather, we see Foresight as something that we do in communities, in our networks, in our institutions. And very often, if we do Foresight well, it provides us with a real opportunity for self-reflection about how do I show up in the world? What's the role that I play, that my organization or my team plays in the world? And how do we shift that or change that to achieve the kind of future that we want? And that, of course, leads to that third point, that Foresight is about, at some level, engaging the wider community and engaging the interests of that community. And in some instances, you may use Foresight as a tool for advocacy. If you have a particular change that you're driving, that you're supporting, that you're wanting to see happen, Foresight is a very powerful tool to use to enable that change. Now, when we do Foresight, we think about that as a design process. In other words, Foresight is not a singular method. You know, if you've done strategy, you might have done strategic planning, and you've done the SWOT analysis. Foresight is not a single method like a SWOT analysis that you do once and then you've done it. Foresight is a much broader concept than that. In the field of Foresight, some of our colleagues will say that Foresight is an art, because the elements of Foresight are things like facilitation, convening stakeholders, facilitating learning, social learning. But there are parts of Foresight that are also very much a science. There are individuals all around the world that are strongly engaged in academic disciplines, where they often refer to as Foresight as futures studies as opposed to strategic foresight, where they think about it very much as a science with rigor and a systematic approach to doing it. And so what we tend to do in designing Foresight is bring those two perspectives together, where Foresight is a science. There are some rigorous methods. We're going to show you what those are. We can work with you in how we might use those. But it also is very much an art. It's about developing the craft of bringing people together to think about the future and to apply those insights. As mentioned, we do Foresight using a 4-stage journey. And throughout the program, we'll continue to remind you of that 4-stage journey, from scoping to ordering to implications and to integration. And so a Foresight project or a Foresight process very often will have a shape. It will start with making sense of what questions you are trying to get answered, and then it will move into a period of sense making, and then it will move into a period of understanding the implications, and of course the period of integrating those implications into the organization and changing the organization. It is at some level about understanding the context. So if you're doing foresight as a business, you might be concerned about the industry context or the economy. If you're doing foresight as a government, you might be thinking about the national context or the international or regional context. And so foresight really gives us tools to think systematically about the context. I remember doing some foresight with an organization in Egypt at the time of the Arab Spring, very much thinking about that regional contextual uncertainty and what it means for them. And then lastly, very importantly, foresight is about mobilizing both creative and analytical approaches. So some of what we do in foresight is quite cerebral, it's quite analytical, right? You might say, what are the key drivers of economic growth? And get quite statistical and quantitative and analytical about that question. But to do good foresight, you may have to bring creative thinking to that process, or creative processes between different people with different points of view, between artists and economists, between policy planners and community activists. And so when we do foresight, we like to take a purposeful, complex, and participative approach that allows us to experiment with different ways of doing foresight, depending on, of course, the key question that we're trying to answer in the process of doing that. Now, in this module, which of today is the start of, today, in fact, is part A of a three-part module. In this module, what we're going to be covering is this idea of how to think like a futurist. When I was studying my master's in foresight, we had this debate between the professors and the students of, do we want to be called futurists? Maybe we don't. Maybe you say, no, I don't want to be called a futurist. I'm an analyst or I'm a strategist. But and so that's not the important question. The important question is, what kind of thinking are we doing when we are doing foresight, when we're grappling with the future? And it's really about demonstrating in this module A foresight approaches, how these foresight approaches are different from other approaches, because there are other approaches to thinking about the future. A very popular one, of course, is forecasting. Secondly, how do we understand the four-stage process, which Pete also referred to? And then lastly, the importance of bringing different perspectives together when we're doing foresight. Now, why do people do foresight? I've touched on this briefly, but let me unpack it a little bit more. And I'm quoting here from a futurist in Houston in the United States, at Houston Clear Lake, where they have a great foresight program. People use foresight to challenge their assumptions. Maybe they're doing policy foresight about a political outcome, challenging those assumptions to avoid future surprises or threats. So in the military or the intelligence, very often we do foresight to think about alternative possible threats, to generate future possibilities or options, as I've said, or perhaps to extend our time horizons. Perhaps we think in an organization, if it's a political party, it will often think over a 5-year period or a 4-year period until the next election. But you might need to think 20 years out or 30 years out about demographics or climate change or women empowerment. And so can we extend our time horizon and think at that strategic level? Or you may want to anticipate the shape of the future. You might say, what's the role of artificial intelligence in health, in old age homes, or homes for the elderly in 2050? And so that could be an interesting foresight project. Or you might want to align an organization or community around change. So if you have a rural, underdeveloped community that's being disrupted by industrialization or technology, can you bring them together using foresight to align their interests and make them more comfortable with the future? So those are some of the purposes of foresight. Now, I want to talk about this question of how is foresight different from forecasting? Because many times economists, engineers, financial auditors, or financial planners will use numbers to think about the future in a fairly linear way. And we typically call that forecasting, right? So the US Department of Transport did this interesting study where they, over many decades, forecast trillions of miles for vehicle travel in the US. Now, the interesting thing about their forecast is it was fairly linear, right? You see this sort of general progression from left to right of their anticipated miles traveled by road. But what's interesting about this is around 2007, the road traffic in the US began to tip off. Now, of course, you could ask the question, why was this? Was it about the economy? Was it about behavior, people working from home? Was it about less cars on the road? But what's interesting, from 2007 onwards, the US Department of Transport continued to forecast their road usage in a linear way into the future, and failed in terms of their institutional analysis to account for this change in the trajectory of road transport. Now, why is that? I'm curious if you have any thoughts about what were they missing? Why is it that this organization was thinking inside a particular mental model? Is there anyone in the room who would like to unmute or pop a comment in the chat? Why do you think the Department of Transport continued to sort of push ahead with this view? Any thoughts on that? I don't see any hands going up. Anyone in the chat who would like to comment? What were they missing? Sanders says there in the chat, they don't understand the underlying structure. Or maybe what Piers says, they kept assuming people would opt for personal cars. I think you're both right. They were probably assuming that the underlying behavior and structure of that system was going to perpetuate itself into the future. To Pierce's point, they kept assuming people were using cars. Tamara saying because their funding relied on continued growth. That's interesting, Tamara. Sometimes there's an institutional interest in seeing a future that looks exactly like the past. Now, I want to go into a breakout group here in a minute to talk a little bit about how we see foresight in our own organizations. But before I do that, let me bring our colleague Johan in for a second. Johan, you did some interesting work on the future of transport. I think you were working with Toyota in the US. What was your experience, if you want to share with us briefly?
Yes, thank you, Marius. That was interesting. We did a project on the future of mobility, and then specifically mobility as a service. And that was at the time where companies like Uber were really growing. And what was underlying, we talked about the structure just now, which is a great comment. Some of the things we picked up that in a sense influenced this as well was the fact that it was for the US market, but that people like long distance travel. But when they do that, they prefer flying and then car rentals at the destination, even though there's an extensive interstate highway in the US. But what was more interesting, really, which a forecast wouldn't necessarily reflect in that sense, was the fact that there's a shift in values with the younger generations, something about in-travel connectivity and being able to use your mobile phone and entertainment and comfort while traveling becomes more important than having a fast car where there's speed limits and lots of traffic, for instance, or just the rising cost of car ownership, especially when you travel long distances. And then together with that, there was something about the services culture of the US consumer market, which really boosted alternative ways or forms of mobility, etc., as well as online working. So already then there was this huge complexity of a network of complex drivers or trends, if you will, that really would influence a forecast like this in ways we couldn't necessarily preempt. Thank you, Marius.
Thank you, and that's excellent. So the point we're making is what foresight allows you to do compared to forecasting is to expand your analysis and take account of that complexity and all of that change that is possible, that's part of the system. Now, what I'd like to do is to invite you to, and there I've accidentally changed screen, let me go back there, is to invite you to participate in a quick discussion. What we'd like to do is to send you off for a few minutes, 7 minutes, into random breakout groups. You're going to be 3 people in a room, and we'd like you to talk about this question. What sort of futures or foresight already happens in your organization? Are you an organization that's locked into sort of forecasting-based work? Or are you someone who's using Foresight widely in different ways and creative ways? We'd love for you to share. And so I'm going to ask Ruth, if you're ready, Ruth, to share, to send us into our groups, and we'll come back in 7 minutes and hear from you what you shared. Thank you, Ruth.